Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I want to speak to the people who have loved with an open heart, who have given without holding back, who have poured their soul into someone who didn't know how to receive it. I want to speak to the empaths, the feelers, the fixers, the healers, who always believed that love could soften anyone, change anyone, or reach anyone. But most importantly, I want to speak to the empath who's been hurt one time too many, who has been pushed past their breaking point, who woke up one morning and realized something inside them has shifted forever. An empath does not become avoidant because they suddenly lose the ability to feel or because their heart turns cold. They become avoidant because they've been hurt so many times that their system finally stops allowing access to the wrong people. It is a transformation born not from bitterness, but from emotional exhaustion. Empaths enter relationships with their hearts wide open. They believe in the goodness of people. They give the benefit of the doubt. They nurture, they heal, they soften, they love deeply. But when that love is met with inconsistency, manipulation, withdrawal, disrespect, or emotional unavailability over and over again, something inside them quietly snaps. The empath, who once poured overflowing compassion into another person, now feels the weight of their own depletion, the heaviness of giving without receiving, and the deep ache of loving someone who did not know how to love them back. This shift does not happen overnight. It builds slowly. Every time their kindness is taken for granted, every time their forgiveness is abused, every time their patience is exploited. At first, they hold on. Empaths always try a little harder than they should. They explain their feelings. They communicate their needs. They try to understand. They give more chances than most people would. They try to fix what's broken, not realizing that some people choose to stay broken because brokenness gives them power. Empaths keep offering love, thinking it will awaken the best in someone, not realizing it may only activate the person's worst traits: entitlement, dependency, emotional laziness. Eventually, the empath reaches a point where their heart cannot stretch any further. The pain becomes too familiar. The disappointment becomes predictable. They recognize a pattern they've spent months or years denying. And the moment they realize they're sacrificing their own emotional well-being for someone who will never meet them halfway, the empath experiences a powerful shift. They stop. They stop absorbing the other person's pain. They stop explaining their own. They stop believing that love must hurt. They stop accepting breadcrumbs. They stop fighting for someone who never fought for them. They stop handing out access to a heart that was never protected. This is the moment the empath becomes avoidant, not because they no longer want love, but because they can no longer tolerate pain disguised as love. They begin to detach to survive. They emotionally withdraw to protect themselves. They create space where they used to pour affection. They stop responding instantly. They stop rescuing others from their own emotional consequences. They stop internalizing every problem as their responsibility. The empath who used to overfunction begins to underinvest. They start acting in ways that confuse the very people who drained them: distant, calm, unavailable, unbothered. People who once manipulated their empathy suddenly feel powerless. People who once played hot and cold lose the emotional control they once had. People who once weaponized silence now crumble when the empath goes silent. Because empaths who become avoidant build boundaries that are nearly impossible to cross again. Their detachment is not a tactic. It's a final chapter. It's the result of emotional erosion, not emotional strategy. And something deeper happens beneath the surface. The empath begins to see themselves clearly for the first time. They recognize their own worth. They see how much they gave. They understand how little they received. They realize that loving deeply is a strength, but loving the wrong people becomes a wound. They find strength in solitude, peace in distance, clarity in silence. They become more selective, more guarded, more discerning. Their intuition becomes sharper. Their tolerance becomes lower. Their self-respect becomes non-negotiable. This transformation is often misunderstood by others. They might say the empath changed, shut down, or became cold. But what they don't understand is that the empath didn't become avoidant out of malice. They did it because they outgrew self-abandonment. They finally understand that empathy without boundaries is self-destruction. They choose themselves because no one else chose them. Once this shift happens, the empath never goes back. They love differently, slower, wiser, with boundaries. They no longer accept half love. They no longer tolerate emotional inconsistency. They no longer chase connection. They allow people to earn access. They become the version of themselves they should have been all along: open-hearted, but not open to everyone, loving, but no longer self-sacrificing, empathetic, but no longer naive. And this ultimately is why the empath becomes avoidant after being hurt too many times. Not to punish others, but to protect the part of themselves that once gave too freely to those who never deserved it. When the empath stops explaining, fixing, and forgiving, it is not a sign that they have become cold. It is a sign that they have finally reached emotional exhaustion. Empaths spend so much of their lives carrying the emotional weight of others that they don't even realize how heavy it is until they finally put it down. For months or years, they have been the one who initiates conversations, softens tensions, apologizes first, checks in, tries to repair, and tries to understand. They have been the emotional anchor, the one who loves even when it hurts, the one who listens even when they're tired, the one who forgives even when their heart is breaking. But there comes a moment when something inside them stops, not gradually, not gently, but suddenly, like a switch flipping. And when that switch flips, the empath no longer has the capacity to keep explaining their worth to someone who never valued it. When the empath stops explaining, it means the fight within them has ended. Not because they were defeated, but because they are done fighting battles that only destroy them. Their silence becomes the language of self-respect. They no longer feel the urge to justify their feelings to someone who consistently dismissed them. They no longer feel the need to convince someone of their intentions. They no longer apologize for emotions that were real, honest, and human. They no longer beg someone to understand the pain they caused. They allow the conversation to end, not because they don't care, but because they care too much about themselves to stay in a cycle that keeps draining their balance. When the empath stops fixing, it means they've finally realized they cannot repair someone who refuses to look at their own damage. They cannot heal a person who clings to their wounds for identity. They cannot uplift someone who uses emotional chaos as a shield. Empaths have a natural tendency to see the best in people, the potential, the soft parts, the hidden goodness. But when they've been hurt repeatedly, they learn a painful truth: potential is meaningless if the person chooses their patterns over their growth. So the empath lets go of the responsibility they never should have carried in the first place. They stop trying to rescue the relationship. They stop trying to interpret mixed signals. They stop trying to soothe someone who refused to soothe them. They stop trying to fix what the other person kept breaking. And in that moment, the empath's energy returns home to them, no longer leaking into a bottomless emotional void. When the empath stops forgiving, it isn't because they're holding a grudge. It's because they finally recognize the difference between forgiveness and self-abandonment. Empaths forgive quickly, deeply, and repeatedly. They forgive long after the apology stops. They forgive even when the hurt continues. But after being hurt too many times, they learn the hardest lesson of all. Forgiveness without change is another form of self-betrayal. So they stop offering forgiveness to someone who has done nothing to earn it. They stop giving chances to someone who has only used those chances to repeat the same behavior. They stop allowing their compassion to be used as a loophole for disrespect. They stop giving people access to parts of their heart that were meant to be protected, not exploited. This is the moment the empath's silence becomes their boundary. It becomes their healing. It becomes their way of saying, "I am done letting this destroy me." Their quiet is not a punishment. It is a declaration of independence. It is the first time in a long time that they choose their own peace over the chaos of someone else's emotional immaturity. And ironically, that silence becomes the very thing the other person cannot handle, because the people who once relied on the empath's emotional labor suddenly find themselves facing consequences they never expected. No more explanations to manipulate, no more forgiveness to fall back on, no more attempts to fix what they kept breaking. The empath's silence creates an echo, An echo that exposes the truth. It exposes who really cared. It exposes who really tried. It exposes who really carried the relationship. It exposes the emotional imbalance that the empath once tolerated out of love. And for the first time, the empath sees the relationship clearly. Not through their hope, but through the reality of how they were treated. When the empath stops explaining, fixing, and forgiving, they step into a version of themselves that is no longer emotionally accessible to those who drained them. They no longer respond with softness to someone who responded with indifference. They no longer carry someone who refused to stand with them. Their silence becomes a shield, not a weapon. It is the moment they stop trying to earn love and start choosing themselves. And once an empath chooses themselves, they never return to the version of them that handed their power away so easily. When an empath finally detaches, the very people who once took them for granted feel a shock they never expected, because empaths are the type of people others assume will always be there. They assume the empath will continue showing up, continue caring, continue forgiving, continue holding space, no matter how carelessly they were treated. Empaths become emotional safety nets for people who never learned how to nurture connection. They become the stability in someone else's chaos, the softness in someone else's coldness, the understanding in someone else's silence. And because the empath has always been the giver, people convince themselves that the giving will never stop. But when the empath finally reaches their limit and detaches, it is a wake-up call so powerful that it shakes the very people who used to rely on their compassion. The moment the empath pulls back, the dynamic shifts dramatically. The manipulator suddenly realizes their emotional influence is gone. The avoidant suddenly feels the absence of a heart that once chased them. The narcissist suddenly feels powerless because their favorite target of emotional feeding is no longer available. The inconsistent partner suddenly feels panic because the person who once gave endless chances now gives none. It's not the empath's anger that scares them. It's the empath's indifference. Empathic silence harder than any confrontation, because silence is final. It signals that the empath is no longer negotiating, no longer explaining, and no longer emotionally accessible. When the empath detaches, it creates an emotional vacuum the other person does not know how to handle. They were used to reacting to the empath's empathy. They were used to seeing the empath soften during conflict. They were used to the empath apologizing just to restore peace. But now, there is no softness. There is no peacekeeping. There is no emotional cushioning. There is only quiet. And that quiet confronts them with a truth they avoided for far too long. The empath was the one sustaining the relationship. The empath was the one keeping the connection alive. The empath was the one doing the emotional labor that made the relationship feel stable, even when it wasn't. People who drain empaths often believe they hold the power until the empath stops giving. Suddenly, the balance flips. The avoidant who once pulled away now wonders why the empath feels distant. The narcissist who controlled the emotional rhythm now feels ignored. The manipulator who once played on the empath's insecurities now feels the sting of their own irrelevance. The inconsistency that once worked so well stops working entirely, because the empath's detachment removes the emotional fuel the other person used to control the dynamic. Without the empath's reactions, the entire system collapses. And here is what truly terrifies the people who mistreated the empath. Once an empath detaches, they rarely come back. It's not a temporary shutdown. It's not a dramatic pause. It's a deep shift in their emotional wiring. Empaths don't detach out of impulse. They detach out of clarity. They detach because they finally see the relationship for what it was, not what they hoped it could be. They detach because the pain has accumulated to a point where staying would mean losing themselves. They detach because they have finally realized that no matter how much love they gave, nothing changed. And when the empath understands this, their heart no longer reaches outward, it turns inward. This inward shift is what scares the other person the most. The empath's energy, which once flowed toward them endlessly, now flows towards self-healing, self-protection, and self-respect. The person who once assumed the empath would always be available suddenly experiences emotional withdrawal in a way they are not prepared for. And because toxic and avoidant individuals are emotionally dependent on the empath's attention. Their panic grows as the empath pulls away. The absence feels heavier than the presence ever did. The empath's detachment reveals something the other person never wanted to face. They were replaceable. But the empath was not. They were temporary. But the empath was foundational. They were inconsistent. But the empath was the glue that held things together. And the moment that glue is gone, everything falls apart. This is why people who once took the empath for granted panic the moment the empath detaches. They're not panicking because they suddenly appreciate the empath. They're panicking because they are losing the emotional control they once had. They're losing access to a heart that was rare, to love that was deep, and to patience that was extraordinary. They realized too late that the empath they dismissed was the most valuable connection they had. When the empath detaches, it isn't revenge. It isn't manipulation. It isn't punishment. It is the final expression of self-respect. And once that self-respect awakens, the empath is no longer someone who can be taken for granted ever again. When an empath finally begins to care for themselves first, it doesn't happen because they woke up one morning and decided to stop loving others. It happens because they spent years loving people who never learned to love them back with the same depth, the same intention, or the same emotional responsibility. At some point, the empath reaches a moment where they can no longer carry the weight of other people's emotional chaos. They can no longer be the healer, the fixer, the forgiver, and the emotional anchor for everyone else, while receiving nothing that nourishes them in return. And when that moment arrives, the shift is not dramatic. It is quiet, internal, powerful. It is the moment the empath realizes that saving themselves is more important than saving relationships that were already drowning. This shift is often misunderstood. People assume the empath has become cold, distant, or unfeeling. They assume the empath has changed into someone harder or more guarded. But the truth is that the empath hasn't become less loving. They've simply stopped giving love to people who don't value it. They've stopped pouring into empty cups. They've stopped bleeding emotionally for people who wouldn't even offer a bandage in return. They've stopped sacrificing their mental health to keep relationships alive that were never mutual in the first place. The empath isn't becoming selfish, they're becoming balanced. The empath's entire life has been shaped around caring deeply. They grew up understanding pain instinctively. They learned to read emotions long before they could understand their own. They became the emotional safe space for people who didn't know how to process their feelings. And because they carried this role for so long, they normalized the idea that their needs should come last, that their comfort was less important, that their boundaries were flexible, that their love should be unconditional, even when the relationship was harming them. But life eventually teaches the empath a lesson they never expected. Unconditional giving without reciprocity leads to emotional exhaustion, not emotional connection. The exact moment the empath chooses themselves is life changing. Instead of asking, how do I make them happy? They begin to ask, how do I make myself whole? Instead of wondering whether they are enough for someone else, they begin to wonder whether that person was ever enough for them. Instead of fighting to be understood, they walk away with the understanding that not everyone deserves access to their heart. Instead of shrinking themselves to fit someone else's comfort, they start expanding into their own truth. And this expansion often looks like detachment to outsiders, but to the empath, it feels like liberation. This new sense of self-care does not eliminate their empathy, it refocuses it. They begin to choose relationships that feel safe, mutual, and nourishing. They begin to form boundaries that once terrified them. They begin to say no without guilt. They begin to prioritize peace over intensity, clarity over confusion, and emotional responsibility over emotional dependency. They begin to understand that protecting their energy is not cruelty. It is wisdom. And most importantly, they begin to realize that their value was never dependent on how much they could tolerate. This internal shift often shocks the people who once relied on the empath's endless generosity. The avoidant partner who was used to being forgiven is suddenly met with boundaries. The manipulator who once played with the empath's vulnerability is suddenly cut off. The inconsistent partner who once took advantage of the empath's loyalty, suddenly feels the consequences of their own behavior. And the narcissistic individual who once fed on the empath's emotional openness is met with silence, a silence they cannot control, influence, or manipulate. When the empath begins to care for themselves first, it forces everyone around them to confront the truth that the empath was the one holding the emotional structure of the relationship together. The truth that without the empath's effort, patience, and emotional maturity, the relationship falls apart. The truth that the empath's love was not something cheap or replaceable. And the truth that the empath's emotional availability is a privilege, not a guarantee. In caring for themselves, the empath does not lose their capacity for compassion. They refine it. Their empathy becomes selective rather than indiscriminate. It flows toward people who deserve it, appreciate it, and reciprocate it. And while this transformation may seem like the empath has become avoidant, it is actually the empath becoming aligned with their own worth. They are no longer defined by the wounds of others. They are guided by the healing of themselves. And once the empath steps into this version of themselves, they can never go back to who they were. Their heart becomes wiser. Their boundaries become stronger. Their silence becomes powerful. And their love becomes something they give only to those who can hold it with respect, responsibility, and intention. When the empath finally wakes up to their worth, the entire emotional dynamic shifts in a way that most people never see coming. For years, the empath has been conditioned to believe that their value lies in how much they can give, how patient they can be, how forgiving they are, and how much chaos they can endure without breaking. They move through relationships carrying the emotional weight of two people, often believing that love means sacrificing themselves. They stay longer than they should, tolerate more than they deserve, and give loyalty to people who wouldn't walk a single mile for them. But there comes a moment, quiet, internal, and unstoppable, when the empath realizes the truth. They have mistaken endurance for love, and they have confused their tolerance for strength. This realization is not loud or dramatic. It is gentle but earth-shattering. It's the moment the empath looks at the pattern of their relationships and finally sees the imbalance clearly. They see how often they apologized first, even when they were the ones hurt. They see how often they compromised their needs just to avoid conflict. They see how often they gave reassurance to someone who offered none in return. They see how often they held space for someone who never held space for them. And this clarity hits them harder than any heartbreak ever could, because it is the first time they understand that their love has been taken for granted, not cherished. Once the empath wakes up, they stop chasing people who give them crumbs of affection. They stop begging for effort from someone who only shows up when it's convenient. They stop trying to convince someone to treat them with the bare minimum of care and respect. They stop rewriting the story to justify someone else's emotional immaturity. They stop bending just to keep the connection alive. They stop sacrificing their mental health for someone who can't even offer emotional consistency. And with this shift, they reclaim something they didn't even realize they had lost: their self-respect. When an empath wakes up to their worth, they learn to walk away without shutting down their heart. They don't leave because they stopped loving. They leave because they finally realized love should not require the destruction of their inner peace. They don't distance themselves out of spite. They distance themselves to protect the remaining parts of them that were almost destroyed. They don't go silent to punish. They go silent because their energy can no longer be wasted on someone who refuses to grow. This silence becomes their boundary, their healing, and their power. In this new state, the empath no longer romanticizes potential. They no longer get attached to who someone could be. They pay attention to who that person is right now. They stop making excuses for someone's behavior and start holding people accountable for how they treat them. They no longer overlook red flags out of fear of being too sensitive. They no longer settle for inconsistency, mixed signals, or emotional unavailability. They raise their standards not out of arrogance, but out of self-preservation. And the world around them reacts immediately. Those who exploited their kindness feel the shift first. The avoidant partner, who once relied on the empath's emotional stamina begins to feel the absence sharply. The manipulative individual who once fed on their empathy feels starving when the supply stops. The inconsistent person who once took their loyalty for granted begins to panic when the empath's energy withdraws. People who once thought the empath would always stay begin to realize their mistake, because nothing is more shocking than losing someone who gave endlessly. As the empath wakes up, they also learn something profound. Love should feel safe, mutual, and nourishing. Love is not supposed to be a battlefield where one person bleeds and the other feels comfortable. Love is not supposed to be a constant cycle of chasing, apologizing, and proving your worth. Love is not supposed to make you feel small, confused, or unimportant. Real love is reciprocal. Real love is conscious. Real love meets you halfway. And when the empath finally understands this, they vow never to shrink themselves again to fit inside someone else's emotional limitations. They learn that their heart is powerful, but it is not a resource for the undeserving. They learn that their sensitivity is strength, not something to be exploited. They learn that their loyalty is sacred, and only people who can match it deserve access to it. They learn that their worth was never tied to how much they tolerated, but to how deeply they could feel, love, and connect. When an empath wakes up to their worth, they do not become less emotional. They become more intentional. They do not stop loving. They stop loving the wrong people. They do not stop giving. They start giving to those who give back. They become someone who chooses themselves, not as a last resort, but as a standard. And once this awakening happens, they never return to the old version of themselves, because self-worth, once discovered, becomes unshakable. When the empath transforms and chooses themselves, the world often assumes that the relationship simply ended, that the connection dissolved, that two people went their separate ways. But what actually happens is far deeper, far more profound, and far more permanent. When the empath reaches their breaking point and finally steps out of the cycle of giving, fixing, absorbing, and forgiving, the emotional dynamic doesn't just shift, it ends. The pattern that once looped endlessly finally dies. The identity that once defined the empath no longer exists. And this is what changes everything, not just for the empath, but for the person who hurt them. When the empath evolves, they do not just walk away. They ascend. They become someone who no longer feels responsible for healing broken partners who refuse to heal themselves. They no longer carry emotional burdens that were never theirs to hold. They no longer prioritize relationships that starve them while feeding someone else's ego. They no longer identify with the role of the strong one who must tolerate emotional unavailability, mixed signals, and inconsistent love. They step into a new version of themselves that is built on self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and unshakable boundaries. And once this happens, the relationship dynamic that existed before can never return, because the empath is no longer the same person who accepted pain in the name of love. This transformation sets off a chain reaction that the other person never expected. The avoidant, who once felt comfortable in the empath's endless devotion, suddenly feels the absence of emotional safety they took for granted. The person who relied on the empath's unconditional love suddenly realizes that love no longer flows toward them. The individual who once felt superior or detached suddenly confronts the loss of someone who held them through their chaos without ever asking for anything in return. This is the moment regret begins, because they realize too late that the empath's emotional presence was the one thing that kept the relationship alive. But this regret doesn't change the empath's trajectory. The empath has moved inward. They have shifted their focus from external validation to internal healing. They have redirected the love they once gave outwards into themselves. And through this inward journey, they discover a strength they never knew they possessed. They realize that their emotional depth is not a weakness. It is a gift. They realize that their ability to love deeply does not make them fragile. It makes them extraordinary. They realize that the right person will never punish them for loving too much. The right person will rise to meet them. This realization becomes the foundation of their transformation. The empath stops seeking closure from the person who hurt them. They stop waiting for apologies that will never come. They stop replaying scenarios, trying to figure out what they could have done differently. They stop trying to understand why the other person didn't choose them. They stop feeling guilty for walking away. Instead, they begin to understand the truth. Sometimes people lose you because they are not ready for the type of love you carry. Sometimes people choose distance because your emotional depth exposes their emotional limitations. Sometimes people reject you not because you lack value, but because they lack capacity. The empath's silence becomes the embodiment of their growth. It is not avoidance. It is emotional clarity. It is not punishment. It is protection. It is not indifference. It is wisdom. Their silence represents the final stage of their transformation, the dissolution of the old pattern. The empath no longer engages in the cycle, no longer allows themselves to be pulled back into emotional chaos, no longer feels obligated to prove their worth. They simply move on, not with bitterness, but with understanding. And this is what the other person never recovers from. They do not lose the empath because the empath stopped caring. They lose the empath because the empath finally realized they deserved better. And once that truth is internalized, there is no going back. The relationship dynamic only dies when the empath stops feeding it. And once they stop, the avoidant cannot revive it. No matter how many mixed signals, apologies, or attempts at reconnection they try, the empath sees the pattern for what it is, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. In the end, the empath's transformation is final. They do not return to the person who broke them. They do not re-enter the cycle they escaped. They do not shrink themselves again for someone else's comfort. They carry their lessons forward, loving with depth but with boundaries, giving with intention instead of sacrifice, connecting with discernment instead of desperation. The old version of them dies so a wiser, stronger, and more aligned version can live. And that is why the pattern ends forever, because the empath has finally become someone who honors themselves first,